She gave everything to save her son. Every dollar, every breath, every hour worked in silence. For Rosa Jenkins, a widowed housekeeper, the little house in Bristol Heights wasn't just bricks. It was the only place her sick son Caleb could breathe without fear. But one morning, everything crumbled. A cold eviction notice, a bank that saw only profit, a countdown no mother is ready for. What they didn't expect was him. A man no one saw coming. A decision that would silence cameras, stop reporters, and rewrite two destinies in one impossible act. Stay with us, because what happens next will restore your faith in the power of love, justice, and a key that refused to be taken. Rosa Jenkins didn't expect anything different from that morning. Her routine had become mechanical. Wake up before dawn, boil water for instant coffee, check Caleb's temperature without waking him, fold the same 3 dish towels, and press her palm against the old window pane to guess the weather. But as she reached for the handle of the front door, her fingers paused mid-air. There was something already pinned to the outside, barely visible through the mottled glass. A single, crinkled sheet flapped once in the draft. She opened the door slowly and stared at it. The paper was white, the text in harsh black ink, notice to vacate 30 days. Her name was printed in bold, the legal tone unmistakable. No greeting, no kindness, no explanation, just facts and deadlines. She read it again, this time aloud, as if saying it would make it more absurd. 30 days, she murmured. That was it. No appeals, no meetings, no conversation. She hadn't even received a phone call. She stood on the porch barefoot, blinking at the paper like it might rewrite itself if she stared long enough. But the ink didn't smudge, and the notice didn't lie. She stepped back into the house, holding the paper with stiff fingers, the door creaking shut behind her. Her slippers made no sound as she walked toward the kitchen, but she wasn't thinking about breakfast anymore. The paper trembled slightly in her hand, and it wasn't the wind this time, it was her. She set it on the kitchen table beside Caleb's asthma medication, which now sat mostly empty. Her eyes flicked to the wall clock. The pharmacy wouldn't open for another 2 hours. Behind her, a dry cough echoed from the bedroom. Rosa didn't rush to check on him. She stood still, pressing her thumb into the edge of the eviction notice, as if trying to erase it by pressure alone. Her mind started to race through the usual routes. Who she could call, what she could sell, whether the last envelope of emergency cash in the bread tin would even make a dent. She knew the answer before she asked herself. It wouldn't. That envelope was already spoken for. Hospital bills, 2 weeks overdue. It didn't matter how early she woke up, how hard she scrubbed other people's floors, how many buses she took to get from one house to another. It had never been enough. Not since Caleb's diagnosis. Not since Thomas died. Not since everything began unraveling. She finally turned and walked into the small bedroom they shared. Caleb lay curled on his side, a tangle of thin limbs and hospital-worn pajamas, one hand loosely gripping the frayed edge of his blanket. His breathing was shallow again, just like the night before. She crouched beside him and gently adjusted the humidifier near his bed, then reached for the rescue inhaler on the nightstand. 2 puffs left, maybe 1. She tested it with a light squeeze just to be sure. No sound. She pressed her fingers to his forehead. Still warm, not a fever, but close. He stirred slightly but didn't wake. Rosa exhaled through her nose and sat on the edge of the mattress, folding the eviction notice in half and tucking it into her apron pocket. There was no point in waking him yet. What would she even say? "We're losing the house," wasn't something you whispered to a sick child at sunrise, especially not when the house was the one place where his chest stopped heaving long enough for him to sleep. She ran her fingers through his curls, carefully not to wake him. "Just breathe, baby," she whispered. "Just breathe." She stayed like that for a while, frozen between exhaustion and dread. The eviction notice felt like a betrayal signed by a stranger, but it was more than that. It was the final reminder that in the eyes of the world, her home was a property, just lines on a map and numbers in a bank ledger. Not the place where Caleb learned to walk, not where Thomas once painted the front door green, for good luck, he'd said. Not where Rosa used to hum lullabies to calm the night terrors after each hospital visit. She looked around the room, the taped-up window, the peeling wallpaper with faded stars Caleb had drawn with marker, the plastic bag of medications tied to the headboard so she wouldn't forget doses. These weren't flaws. These were the fingerprints of survival. Yet none of it mattered now. The bank wanted her out, and Rosa had no legal standing to fight, no lawyer, no savings, no backup plan, just 30 days and a boy who couldn't breathe well enough to walk up a hill. She finally moved to the kitchen again, grabbing the bottle of tap water she'd filled the night before. She poured it into a clean cup, clean because she hand-washed it herself at 11 p.m. and sat at the table. She unfolded the notice again and flattened it on the surface. In the corner, a logo, North River Financial. She'd never even heard of them before this week. Some development firm, she guessed, probably buying up the whole block. It made sense. 3 of her neighbors had already vanished, leaving only darkened windows and for sale signs that were gone the next day. But she never thought they'd come for her. Not like this. Not without warning. She stared at the bold print one last time, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a pen. She circled the date, red ink, sharp and accusing. 30 days. Not 31. Not a grace period. And certainly no dignity. Her eyes moved to the ceiling, where a water stain had darkened above the table, one of the many things she'd never had money to fix. But this wasn't about repairs. It was about erasure. About how easy it was for someone in a suit to decide you didn't belong. Caleb coughed again from the other room, sharper this time. Rosa stood. She folded the notice again, slower now, like handling something fragile, and slid it into the bread tin with the cash. That space was sacred, emergency only, and this, if anything ever was, qualified. She walked to the hallway and pressed her forehead gently against the frame of Caleb's door. "It's just paper," she said aloud, as if saying it made it true. Just paper. But when she opened her eyes, the truth was louder. That house was more than wood and walls. It was the only place where her son could breathe in peace. And now, even that was slipping away. Rosa saw the car before she saw the man. It was parked too neatly in front of her house, not crooked like the neighbors' cars, not splattered with dust or missing a mirror like hers. A sleek, least perfect sedan. She knew before he even knocked that whoever stepped out of that vehicle didn't come to check on her son. The knock was gentle. 2 precise taps. Polite, like a hotel bellhop. When she opened the door, he didn't introduce himself right away. He adjusted his tie instead, then smiled the kind of smile Rosa had come to recognize, a practiced one, built to reassure people before bad news. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, extending a pale, well-moisturized hand. "Peter Langley. I'm with North River Financial. May I come in?" She didn't step aside. Her eyes flicked to the badge around his neck, then back to his eyes. She said nothing, but he took the silence as permission and brushed past her like the hallway already belonged to him. He walked like someone who assumed everything would go his way. Rosa followed, slow, cautious, and quietly counting her breaths. She hated that he didn't ask where to sit. He just picked the cleanest chair and placed a leather folder on the table like it had every answer. "I won't take much of your time," he said, already opening the folder. "You've received the notice, I trust." Rosa didn't respond. Her arms were crossed, her eyes unmoving. Langley continued, undeterred. "Now look, I know this must be a lot, but I'm here to walk you through a solution that works for everyone. These things happen. The market's moved quickly. Bristol Heights has appreciated significantly in the last 2 years. This neighborhood is transitioning. A lot of families have already accepted our offer. We're offering above market value in most cases, and I think you'll find this generous, especially given the circumstances. He slid a single sheet of paper toward her, the print dense and double-spaced, topped with her name in bold. Of course, you're behind on a few things. Property taxes, utility adjustments, but we're not here to punish. We're here to make this smooth, dignified. Rosa's hand didn't move toward the paper. Her gaze hadn't shifted. Langley cleared his throat, then leaned forward. There's no shame in starting over. Change can be good. This neighborhood, he gestured out the window like it was already gone, won't look like this in 6 months. She let him speak, let him fill the room with forecasts and formulas and phrases like market evolution and community redefinition. Let him explain how the new development would bring opportunity and revitalization, and maybe even a coffee shop or two. He never once asked about Caleb, never asked what the house meant to her. To him, it was all location and potential. When he finally paused long enough for air, Rosa stepped forward and gently turned the proposal paper around so it faced him again. Her voice came low but solid. "My son needs this house," she said. "This place is the only one where he sleeps without wires taped to his skin." Langley shifted, blinking as if she'd spoken a language he didn't quite know. "There's no hospital," she continued. "No prescription, no specialist that can fix what gets broken in a child when you take away their home. When you take away the only air they can breathe without fear." She didn't raise her voice, didn't plead, just said it plainly, like truth should be enough. And maybe it should have been. But Peter Langley wasn't in the business of truth. He was in the business of terms. He exhaled, tapping the folder lightly with 2 fingers. "Mrs. Jenkins, I respect your devotion. I really do. But I also know how this works. I'm not the villain here. I'm just here to help you understand what's inevitable." Rosa didn't answer. Her hands, still calloused from years of cleaning homes that weren't hers, hung motionless at her sides. She remembered scrubbing porcelain sinks for people who thanked her with polite smiles and never once asked her name. She remembered folding towels that were softer than Caleb's bedsheets had ever been. She remembered holding his hand during nebulizer treatments in the ER because the machine at home had stopped working again. And now, here was this man, this grey-suited stranger, telling her that what she had was disposable, replaceable. That survival didn't matter because some investor wanted a boutique grocery store where her living room stood. "You've had time to prepare," he added, as if this made him kind. "We sent letters, emails, notices." He pulled another sheet from his folder, proof of paperwork. Rosa didn't flinch. She looked him in the eye and said, "You don't send letters to people you see as human. You send them to things you want removed." Langley blinked slowly, gathering his composure. He slid the paper forward again, deliberately. "There's no use fighting this," he said, softer now, like a teacher trying to get through to a slow student. "You don't have a lawyer. You don't have equity. You don't have leverage." He smiled again, a little tighter this time. "But you have options. Take the buyout. Walk away with some dignity. Give your son a new start somewhere else. That's something, isn't it?" Rosa stared at the folder, then at him, and then she stepped back. Not in fear, not in surrender, but in dismissal. She walked toward the sink and picked up a sponge, squeezing it until the old soap foamed faintly between her fingers. "You can leave the papers on the table," she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a request. Langley hesitated, clearly unsure whether she meant to reconsider or ignore him entirely, but she gave him nothing else, just the sound of the sponge against porcelain, quiet and repetitive. The conversation was over, whether he liked it or not. Langley stood, adjusting his blazer. He left the proposal on the table, perfectly aligned with the wood grain. "You'll think about it," he said, half-heartedly. Rosa didn't turn, didn't nod. He waited for a beat longer, as if expecting something more, a thank you maybe, or a crack in her tone. But she gave him only her back. When the door finally clicked shut behind him, she still hadn't moved. The kitchen returned to its normal silence. Only now, it was heavier. Rosa looked at the paper once more, untouched on the table, and for a brief second she almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was all so incredibly predictable. He had left behind more than documents. He had left the unmistakable scent of someone who'd already decided what should happen to people like her. Someone who believed quiet women stayed quiet. Someone who truly believed that people with little had no voice. But Rosa knew better, and soon, so would he. It started the same way every night, as if rehearsed. At precisely 11 p.m., a black pickup truck would glide to a stop just across the street. Its engine idling so low it barely registered through the walls. The headlights were always off, not even a flicker, and no one ever stepped out. But Rosa knew someone was in there. She'd catch the occasional click of a camera shutter or the faint red glow of a cigarette through the windshield. Most nights, they didn't even pretend to be subtle. They sat there watching, recording, waiting, as if her life were part of a spreadsheet that needed live updates. The truck didn't leave for at least 20 minutes. Then it would coast away, slow, deliberate, only to return the next night at the exact same time. It was a pattern so precise, so controlled, that it felt like a performance staged for one person's unraveling. Rosa never reacted. She never opened the curtains, never called the police. They wouldn't come anyway, not for this. The silence of that engine said more than words ever could. It told her, "We're not rushing. We'll wait until you break yourself." The neighbors were no longer neighbors. The house on the left had sold 3 weeks ago. The one across the street went dark last Friday. The signs disappeared within hours, replaced with vague construction stakes and white markings on the curb. Rosa saw fewer and fewer familiar faces. People who once asked about Caleb now crossed the street when she approached. The woman who used to bring soup on cold days now avoided eye contact entirely. The block was hollowing out, one family at a time, and Rosa felt the emptiness pressing in. It wasn't personal, it was business. That's what Peter Langley had said, and what the truck's presence confirmed. Her home was no longer a home to them. It was a delay in their project plan. But Rosa didn't pack. She didn't waver. She'd walk to the pharmacy, go to work, make dinner, and at night she'd return to the blue envelope she kept in the bread tin. Every hospital bill, every receipt, every proof of payment. They were worn, folded, and refolded, smudged with thumbprints and tears she hadn't meant to cry. She didn't know if they'd matter in the end, but she kept them like weapons. Each night, after making sure Caleb was fed, medicated, and warm, she'd sit beside him on the living room couch while the truck lingered outside. She never told him about the truck. She didn't have to. Caleb never asked about it, but he always knew. He'd glance toward the window even though it was covered, his eyes darting like he could feel the weight of someone watching. At 12 years old, Caleb had grown too familiar with dread. Hospitals had taught him how to read rooms before people spoke, how to measure adults by the way they hesitated before giving bad news. And now, in the silence of their home, he read his mother's pauses just as well. "Still here," Rosa would whisper every night, brushing his hair back with the same slow stroke. "We're still here." Caleb rarely responded with words, but his body relaxed each time she said it. It was the only promise she could make without lying. And yet she could feel him searching, beneath her tone, behind her eyes, for something more than the quiet defiance she offered. He wasn't looking for medicine anymore. He was looking for safety, and Rosa knew there was less and less of it to give. One night, as the truck lingered longer than usual, Caleb looked up at her from his place on the couch. "Why do they come every night?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time he'd mentioned it directly. Rosa didn't flinch. She kept her gaze steady, hands folding the same dish towel she'd been gripping. "They're checking something that doesn't belong to them," she said simply. "But it's ours. They just don't know that yet. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, then leaned against her side. That was enough for now. She didn't offer him hope she couldn't guarantee. She didn't sugarcoat. She gave him a truth strong enough to lean on, however temporary it might be. Outside, the truck finally pulled away. Rosa watched its taillights disappear without moving from her seat. She counted to 60 before exhaling, the weight of another successful night pressing against her ribs. One more night won. One more quiet victory. After Caleb went to bed, Rosa would linger in the hallway a few minutes longer than necessary, fingers trailing along the old family photos nailed slightly crooked to the wall. There was a photo of her late husband holding Caleb at 6 months old, both of them laughing, cheeks round and eyes full of something she hadn't seen in a while. Peace. She placed her hand flat against the wall beside it and closed her eyes, not to remember, but to anchor herself. This was their house. This was their story. They hadn't written it in contracts or deeds or appraisals. They'd written it in sleepless nights and insurance battles and lullabies whispered in hospital corridors. She walked to the kitchen, opened the drawer with the envelope, checked the contents again, even though she knew every crease, then set it back with care. She walked to the door. Rosa turned the lock once, then again, 2 clicks. Every night 2 clicks. She did it slowly, like a ritual. Not because she thought it would stop the inevitable, but because it reminded her that she was still choosing to stay. That while the men in trucks and suits watched and waited, she was still the one standing between her son and the storm. Still here. She whispered to no one this time. Then she let her hand rest on the lock for just a moment longer, her fingers firm against the cold metal before walking away. It was somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning when Rosa gave up pretending she could sleep. The weight in her chest wasn't pain exactly. It was something slower, heavier, like a knot tightening with every passing hour. Caleb had finally drifted into a shallow sleep, wheezing softly through his mouth. Rosa sat on the couch, her legs tucked under her, staring at nothing, afraid of both movement and stillness. She wasn't thinking clearly, just chasing a kind of numb routine, tidying, folding, wiping down corners of an already clean kitchen, until her hand brushed the far edge of the drawer under the hallway cabinet. It stuck for a moment, then gave way with a rough jerk, revealing what she didn't even know she'd forgotten. A soft-covered notebook, dull blue, its spine cracked and corners frayed. She picked it up slowly like it might disintegrate. It was hers, or had been. Her mother's handwriting was on the first page. Rosa hadn't seen that script in years. "Lord, make room where none is found," it read. Below it, lists of grocery items, to-do notes in shaky pen, a few verses underlined, and then suddenly, a wild splash of orange crayon. Caleb's earliest doodles. Rosa sank to the floor with the notebook in her lap. She flipped through the pages slowly, as if unspooling old film. Her mother had used the book for everything, tracking laundry loads, writing shopping reminders, jotting down recipes that never had precise measurements. Somewhere in the middle, Rosa's own handwriting took over. Budget breakdowns, child support calculations from years ago, a quote she'd copied from a pamphlet at the clinic. "Hope doesn't come in whole pieces. Sometimes it arrives one breath at a time." There were more scribbles from Caleb, stick figures with triangle bodies and wide, open-mouthed smiles. Then there were gaps, entire stretches of blank pages left untouched, like silence that had grown roots. And that was where Rosa stopped flipping. She held her pen with trembling fingers, stared at the empty space, and made a choice. She wouldn't use it to plead or plan. She wouldn't write out feelings. Instead, she began filling it with proof. She glued in the electricity bill from last month, paid in full, even if late. She tucked in the medication receipt from 3 weeks ago, highlighted, the ER admission form, a photo of Caleb on the porch, smiling crookedly with a gap between his teeth. It wasn't just record-keeping. It felt like building a case for something no courtroom could name. Rosa didn't believe that North River Financial would ever look at these pages. She didn't believe Peter Langley would care. But that wasn't why she was doing it. This was for her, for Caleb, for the memory of her mother, whose prayers once filled the margins of every notebook, believing that written faith could anchor the soul. Rosa filled the pages with things that made no financial sense, but every emotional one. A letter from the school nurse, praising Caleb's resilience. A yellow post-it with the words, "I breathed better today," scrawled in her son's handwriting. And then, carefully, she pressed into a page the pressed flower Caleb had picked from the churchyard last spring, back when he still had enough energy to run ahead of her. She didn't label it, didn't explain it, just let it be there, silent, delicate, undeniable. By the 5th page, her movements had slowed, but not from exhaustion. It was the weight of memory, of knowing how much had been risked just to stand still. Every document she added, every photo she taped, was a quiet refusal. She wasn't giving them evidence for a court date. She was carving permanence into a world that treated her as temporary. In this house, on this street, through nights of silence and weeks of dread, she had raised a child, paid her dues, sacrificed more than anyone would ever tally. And now she was leaving behind a trail, not for strangers, but for herself. Proof that she had mattered here, that they had mattered. The notebook became more than a container of facts. It became her answer to every banker who thought her disposable, to every official who saw her as a delay. She wasn't trying to win a legal fight anymore. She was documenting that a life had existed, full, hard, worthy, and it had existed here. As dawn began to hint at the window frame, Rosa placed the notebook gently in the bread tin, where she had always kept cash and backup documents. She paused before closing the lid, running her fingers along the warped cover. It was swollen now with layers of defiance, of love, of history that couldn't be priced or parceled out. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. She simply closed the tin, stood up slowly, and exhaled. She had very little left to offer this fight. No legal team, no savings, no miracle waiting in the wings. But now she had this, a quiet, compiled, undeniable testament, and somehow that felt like more than she'd had yesterday. It had happened during a night when sleep wouldn't come, just another restless stretch in a string of many, but it became something else entirely. That was the night Rosa Jenkins found the blue notebook, a relic of the past, a journal of survival, a ledger of life. Its pages had been aged by living, by grief, by hope pressed between grocery lists and gas station receipts. She would never be able to hand it to the men in suits and make them care. But that didn't matter, because now, in the absence of safety and in the face of erasure, she had something to hold. Something that said, we were here, we stayed, we made this home, and in the end, that was all she had left to offer. 2 weeks before the deadline, he came back. This time, Peter Langley didn't arrive alone. He brought a cameraman, a clipboard, and a young assistant with slick hair and eyes that never stopped scanning. Rosa saw them through the window before they knocked, and for a split second, she considered not answering. But the knock came anyway, sharper this time, rehearsed. She opened the door without a word. "Mrs. Jenkins," Peter said, voice smoother than usual but rushed, like a man late for something more important. "Just following protocol today. Nothing alarming. No action being taken." Behind him, the cameraman already had the lens raised, capturing the doorway like it was a crime scene. Rosa stood in silence, her hand resting against the frame. Peter glanced over his shoulder and added, "This is all just for internal documentation. You understand? We want to keep everything above board." His smile didn't touch his eyes. "No one wants an escalation. We're all trying to avoid an incident." Rosa didn't move, didn't blink, Caleb was sitting on the couch behind her, wrapped in the same fleece blanket she'd washed 100 times, his face pale and his chest rising in short, labored bursts. That was the incident, and it was already happening. Peter continued speaking, not waiting for responses. "We've sent everything in writing, of course, but these visits, well, they're about transparency, about accountability, just making sure we're doing things the right way." He gestured vaguely toward the camera. "You don't mind if we document this part of the process, do you? It's standard." Rosa stepped forward, gently pulling the door behind her, blocking the view of Caleb. "You've already documented enough," she said quietly. The assistant scribbled something on a notepad. Peter kept the smile up, but his voice dipped. "There's no need to be hostile, Mrs. Jenkins. We're trying to work with you. But the deadline is approaching, and frankly, it would be in your best interest to avoid complications." She didn't answer. Her hand tightened on the doorknob. She could hear Caleb coughing behind her now, a dry, hacking sound that came in threes. Peter seemed not to notice, or chose not to. "We'll be back next week," he said. "One more visit before the final date. Hopefully by then you'll have made arrangements." The cameraman stopped recording. The assistant folded the notes neatly. No one asked if she needed help. No one looked past her shoulders. As they turned to leave, Rosa stayed rooted to the spot, her breath shallow, her pulse ringing in her ears. She didn't slam the door, just closed it with the same quiet dread she'd lived with for weeks. Then she turned around and saw Caleb trying to sit up, struggling with the blanket tangled around his legs. His face was damp with sweat, and he looked smaller than usual, as if the weight of all this had shrunk him. "Were they from the hospital?" he asked, voice cracking. Rosa knelt beside him, pressing a hand to his forehead. "No, baby," she said softly, "just people who don't understand things that matter." Caleb leaned into her chest, his breathing shallow and irregular. "It hurts to breathe when they're here," he said. And Rosa couldn't argue. She scooped him into her arms, not because she needed to move him, but because she needed to feel that he was still there, that his body still had warmth, that she could still hold on to something that mattered. She sat with him like that, on the floor beside the couch, rocking slightly, humming nothing in particular. Her eyes burned, but she refused to blink. After a while, Caleb's breathing slowed, not better, just quieter, and his head fell against her shoulder, eyes half-lidded but still watching her. "Are we going to leave?" he asked. Rosa didn't know how to lie anymore. "Not yet," she said, and kissed his forehead. She tried to sound brave, but her voice cracked at the edges. "We're still here." Caleb nodded, but his grip on her sleeve tightened. She felt it, his fear, his confusion, his need for something stable in a world unraveling fast. The worst part wasn't the cameras. It wasn't the notices or the men in suits. It was this, watching a child learn too soon what it means to live under siege. Rosa stayed there, holding him, her back pressed against the couch, her legs numb beneath her. She wanted to pray, but nothing formed in her mind except a looping thought. They will not take him from this house. Not while I can still breathe. Eventually, Caleb drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. Rosa didn't move. Her arms ached, her neck stiffened, but she held him like he was made of glass and light and all the things that hadn't yet been ruined. Her face turned slightly toward the front door, as if expecting another knock. None came. Just silence, but this one felt different, not like the quiet that follows a storm, but the kind that comes before collapse. Rosa blinked slowly and realized her cheeks were wet. She hadn't noticed the tears falling. They weren't like the ones she used to cry at night, hidden in the dark where no one could see. These were open, unashamed, not weakness, not surrender, just release. There was nothing left to hold back. She cried because her son was sick, because they were alone, because everything she had fought to protect was slipping inch by inch through her fingers. And so, After the camera crew and the suits were gone, after the soft lies and protocol had faded into the walls, Rosa sat on the floor of her living room, her child in her arms, and for the first time since it all began, she wept without hiding. Not because she had given up, but because there was no longer anything left to hide. The day had come, just like they said it would. No delays, no final miracle, no last-minute reprieve. It was just after 8 in the morning when Rosa heard the official knock. Not the hesitant kind, not even rude, just firm, procedural, cold. She opened the door slowly, already holding Caleb close to her chest. He was burning up. His skin radiated heat through the blanket, and his breathing was shallow, labored. His head rested against her collarbone, too tired to lift. The 2 officers standing outside didn't flinch. They wore the uniform of function, not compassion. "Ma'am," the taller one said, pulling a folded document from a plastic sleeve. "This is the court-issued order of removal. You've been served the required notices. We need to begin." Rosa didn't argue. She didn't scream. She only nodded once and moved back just enough to let them step inside. She didn't beg. She offered them what she had, the blue envelope. "These are all the payments, the receipts, hospital forms. I don't have anything else," she said, her voice cracking at the edges. The officer glanced at the papers but didn't reach for them. They weren't there to read. They were there to remove. Caleb stirred in her arms and coughed weakly. The sound was sharp but empty, like someone trying to cry without the strength to finish. Rosa kissed the side of his head and shifted her weight to keep him upright. "Please," she said, not as a plea, but as a warning. "He's sick. He's not safe out there." The shorter officer glanced at the taller one. "We can't delay," he said under his breath, not low enough for her to miss. "Protocol's clear." Rosa set the envelope on the coffee table with both hands, almost reverently. "He was stable here," she said, her voice steadying even as her eyes shined with unshed tears. "Out there, he won't last." She didn't look at the cameras outside, though she could see the shadows moving beyond the window. They'd come, just like before. Langley had made sure of that. He wanted this part public, a little spectacle, framed as a necessary enforcement of justice. The officers didn't move yet. Rosa could tell they didn't want to be the ones, but they would. They always did in the end. That was how systems worked. Guilt was optional. Action was not. Then came Peter Langley, walking like a man late to his own parade. He wore a grey coat and a smile wide enough to show teeth, his hand raised in a mock greeting to the small crowd of reporters gathered across the street. "Morning," he called out, as if this were a ribbon cutting and not an eviction. He stepped past the officers and straight into the house, surveying the room like it belonged to him. "Rosa," he said, with that same practiced warmth, "let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. These gentlemen are just here to carry out a necessary step. The paperwork is clear. The timeline was generous." Rosa didn't respond. She rocked Caleb slightly, trying to ease the rattle in his breath. Peter looked around at the worn walls, the stack of folded clothes on the couch, the small heater in the corner humming at full power. "Look, you've done your best. No one's denying that. But we can't bend the process for sentiment." He glanced toward the window. "Just be grateful we're keeping it civil. There are worse ways to go than this." He smiled at the camera outside. "She had her chance," he said, as if delivering a eulogy. And then it happened. A sound that cut clean through the tension, the sharp squeal of tires gripping wet pavement. Everyone turned. The officers stepped back toward the door. Langley paused mid-sentence. Rosa instinctively tightened her hold on Caleb. A black SUV, sleek and unfamiliar, came to a full stop in front of the house. The engine idled for a moment before the driver's side door opened. Out stepped a man in a fitted black suit, no umbrella, no hesitation. His presence was immediate, his expression unreadable. He didn't run. He didn't raise his voice. He just walked, straight, calm, measured, across the cracked walkway to the porch steps. Someone outside whispered a name. Others leaned in, unsure. Cameras tilted, journalists shifted, the atmosphere broke. Rosa didn't know who he was yet. But everything about him, the way the officers froze, the way Langley's mouth dropped slightly open, the way the press adjusted their lenses, told her this wasn't ordinary, this wasn't planned, and it wasn't part of Langley's show. He stepped into the house like it belonged to him, or like he had permission from something greater than the bank. His eyes scanned the room, but didn't linger on the mess, the furniture, the papers. He looked at Rosa, then at Caleb, then at Langley, who tried to recover his voice with a clearing of his throat. "Who the hell are you?" Langley asked, his tone turning defensive. The man extended a folder, opened it, and said just one sentence. "I'm Benjamin Cross, and this house is no longer under your jurisdiction." That was all. No flourish, no explanation. The room didn't erupt, but it shifted. Rosa felt it, a sudden rebalancing like a weight had been lifted from a rope pulled too tight. Langley blinked. The officers exchanged glances. Benjamin said nothing more. He didn't have to. And so, on the very morning they came to take everything, with Caleb burning up in her arms and all her hope pinned to a blue envelope no one wanted to read, Rosa watched a stranger in black step across the line they'd drawn around her life and erase it. Benjamin Cross, billionaire, philanthropist. And in that moment, the man who made the entire room forget what they came to do. Benjamin stepped off the curb and into the street, the rain tracing faint lines down his dark coat. He didn't flinch, didn't look up, didn't pause to acknowledge the sea of flashing lights or the questions shouted by reporters desperate for a headline. His gait was measured, purposeful, as if the next 10 seconds were already written somewhere, and all he had to do was walk toward them. Peter Langley, still standing near the porch, with his damp folder of eviction documents, and the stuttering confidence of a man who thought money meant permanence, blinked as Benjamin approached. "Mr. Cross?" Peter asked, unsure whether to feign politeness or panic. But Benjamin didn't respond immediately. He simply stopped in front of him, inches away, their height nearly matched, though power clearly wasn't. With steady eyes and an unbothered tone, Benjamin said, "North River Financial is under new ownership. As of this morning, I hold controlling interest. Which means this house is no longer on the development list. And as for you, your contract has been terminated, effective immediately." There was no flair, no need to raise his voice. The words carried their own gravity, and everyone heard them fall. Peter stammered, a laugh escaping his lips too high-pitched to be convincing. "You can't just... This is absurd," he said, stepping back half a pace. "There are procedures. You can't fire me here. Not like this. This is harassment." Benjamin opened his leather briefcase with clinical precision, extracting a thick legal folder and holding it out like an indictment. The acquisition was filed and cleared before sunrise. All transactional paperwork is notarized and registered. These are the updated board orders. "You're no longer needed." One of the reporters leaned in closer, camera clicking without pause. Peter took the papers with shaking hands, skimming them too fast to read anything, but the way his face drained told the truth anyway. "This is a stunt," he muttered. "You don't even know this woman. Why would you care?" But Benjamin didn't answer him. He didn't owe him a reason. Instead, he turned his back, clean and final. Peter was no longer worth the energy of a second thought, and with that, the man who had bullied half the block into silence was now the only one speechless. The shift was instant. Reporters abandoned Peter like rats from a sinking ship, moving in unison toward Benjamin. Questions rang out, overlapping. Why this house? Are you planning more acquisitions like this? Is this a political statement? But Benjamin raised one hand, not to command silence, but simply to signal that none of it mattered. He walked past the cameras and officers straight toward Rosa, who stood in the doorway as if the entire world had tipped sideways and she was the only one trying to stand upright. Caleb's arms were still looped around her neck, his breathing shallow but steady now, as if some invisible pressure had finally lifted. Rosa didn't speak. She couldn't. There were no words for this moment. She looked at Benjamin like someone trying to remember what hope felt like. He approached without ceremony, his coat dripping, hair soaked, as if he'd walked through a storm without even noticing it. The officers stepped aside without needing to be told. One of them folded the eviction order and slid it back into his pocket, not even bothering to file it. Rosa held her son tighter, instinctively, almost protectively, even though the danger had already passed. Benjamin didn't come close enough to crowd her. Instead, he knelt slowly, lowering himself until he was at her eye level. He reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope, thick with weight. He held it out, resting it gently on her lap. "This is the deed," he said softly. "Your name is on it. The house is no longer under any bank or corporate claim. It's yours." Rosa's lips parted, but no sound came. Her hands trembled as she touched the edge of the envelope, almost afraid it would vanish. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why me?" Benjamin looked down, then met her eyes again. "Because someone once did something like this for my mother, when we had nothing, and I promised myself I'd pass it forward if I ever had the power to do it." Rosa shook her head slightly, tears welling in her eyes, 100 emotions colliding inside her at once. "You don't even know us," she said, voice cracking. Benjamin nodded gently. "I don't need to. I see what's here. That's enough." He reached into his coat again, this time producing a simple card. "This is the contact for my foundation. Starting today, Caleb is enrolled in our pediatric care program. Medical, equipment, anything he needs. We'll take care of it. No applications, no waiting lists. Just call." He didn't smile. He didn't need to. This wasn't about applause. It was about restoration. Rosa clutched the envelope to her chest, sobbing silently now, not from fear, but from relief so total it almost hurt. Behind her, Caleb stirred and whispered, "Mama?" "Bye," and she kissed his forehead, whispering back, "We're okay now, baby, we're okay." Benjamin stood, rain dripping from his cuffs, and looked around one final time. Reporters lowered their cameras. The officers nodded in subdued acknowledgement. Peter was already walking back to his car, defeated. Rosa watched the man in black turn without fanfare and begin his walk back across the street. But not before the world had changed. Even after the SUV disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the end of the street, Rosa remained on her knees. But it wasn't a posture of surrender. Far from it. She wasn't begging anymore. She wasn't waiting for answers. She was holding her son in her arms. His small frame nestled against her chest, the slight rise and fall of his body offering the quietest proof of life. Caleb had fallen asleep mid-tears, not from exhaustion, but because for the first time in months, maybe even years, his breath had steadied. There was no need to keep one eye open, no pounding knock at the door, no voice telling them to leave. Rosa cried freely, the tears hot against her cheeks, her forehead resting on Caleb's shoulder like an anchor. She had no words for the moment, and no one asked her for them. The silence wasn't hollow anymore, it was full. The neighbors, those who had remained hidden behind shutters and drawn curtains, began to reappear like ghosts returning to their bodies. One by one, faces peeked through blinds, then opened their doors. They didn't rush out, didn't crowd her. They stood there, watching her with a reverence she hadn't expected, as if they knew they were witnessing something sacred. One elderly man on the opposite side of the street, whose name Rosa didn't even know, started to clap. Slowly at first, hesitant, almost unsure if it was allowed. But then a second person joined, and a third. The sound grew, not rowdy, but warm. "She stayed!" someone shouted from a balcony. "She won!" cried another. Rosa didn't lift her head. She didn't need to see them. The voices washed over her like balm. They weren't congratulating her victory. They were acknowledging her endurance. They saw her. They finally saw her. Inside the house, nothing had changed physically. The leaky faucet still dripped in the kitchen. The floor still creaked at the third step on the stairs. The paint still peeled behind the bookshelf in the living room. But everything had changed in meaning. The house no longer felt like a shelter she might lose at any moment. It had become a sanctuary again, a place where Caleb could grow instead of just survive. Rosa laid him gently on the couch, covering him with the same blanket he had clung to during the worst nights. He stirred, but didn't wake. For once, even in sleep, he looked unafraid. Rosa stood still, watching him, memorizing the peace on his face as if it were the most precious photograph she would ever hold. She walked toward the small drawer near the door, the one she had barely opened since her mother passed. Inside was the old key, the same one her mother had given her on the day she'd inherited the house. It was worn, its edges dulled, and the top still had the faint etching of her mother's initials, scratched there with a kitchen knife decades ago. Rosa took the key in her hand and closed her eyes. The cool metal rested against her palm like a heartbeat. It wasn't just a tool for locks anymore. It was the last artifact of everything that had tried to be taken from her and hadn't been. She walked to her bedroom, opened her jewelry box, and found a thin silver chain tucked away from years ago, once meant for a church pendant she'd lost long ago. Now, it had a new purpose. She strung the key onto the chain and fastened it around her neck. It felt heavier than it looked, not uncomfortable, but real, tangible, a reminder of what had been fought for and reclaimed. She glanced at herself in the mirror, not to admire, but to bear witness. The key rested at the center of her chest, catching a sliver of lamplight. She whispered under her breath, "No one's taking you again." It was both a promise and a vow. For her, for Caleb, for the woman her mother had raised her to be. There were no more forms to sign, no more men in suits to plead with, just the hum of the house reclaiming its stillness, not as silence, but as safety. That night, Rosa didn't triple lock the door out of fear. She simply closed it, turned the bolt once, and turned off the porch light. She didn't check the window. She didn't keep her shoes by the bed. She tucked Caleb in again, kissed his forehead, and left the door to his room cracked open, like she used to when he was little. She slipped beneath her blankets with the key still around her neck, its weight calming, steady. For the first time in years, she didn't wait for the other shoe to drop. She didn't lie awake planning for what might go wrong. Sleep came easily, and in the back of her mind a simple truth settled. The house was hers. Tomorrow would come, and she would be there, with the doors open and the strength to keep them that way. We poured our hearts into bringing this story to life, each scene, each word, crafted with care and deep respect for real human resilience. If this story moved you in any way, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that matter, stories of strength, love, and the unexpected kindness that changes lives. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. What part of Rosa and Caleb's journey touched you the most? And while you're here, feel free to explore our other videos. Every view, like, and comment helps keep this community growing, and we're truly grateful you're part of it.